Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. On November 4th, 1991, Heather Stigliano left her shift at a Myrtle Beach restaurant just after 9 p.m. She clocked out quietly, waved goodnight to a coworker, and walked into the cool night air toward her car. It was an unremarkable Monday for most people in Horry County, South Carolina. For Heather, it was her final one. She had just moved to the beach town 2 months earlier from Pennsylvania. 19, independent and determined to make something of herself, she worked long hours while chasing a side dream of one day becoming a singer. Her family described her as responsible, cautious, and grounded. She didn't drink. She didn't use drugs. She wasn't the type to disappear, but disappear she did. 3 days passed. Heather didn't show up for work. She missed a scheduled phone call with her mother, Janet. Her landlord noticed mail piling up at her door and a light that had stayed on for days in the living room. Her car, a gray Chevrolet, was gone from the lot. The front door was locked. There were no signs of forced entry, but something didn't sit right. Her manager called it in. The missing persons report was filed on November 7th. At first, police suspected she had left voluntarily. Young women leave beach towns all the time. Bad breakup, maybe a depressive spiral. But Heather didn't have a boyfriend. She didn't have enemies. She had a job, a lease, and a mother who called every day without fail. She had reasons to stay. On November 11, 7 days after she was last seen, Myrtle Beach police obtained a warrant to enter her apartment. Inside Unit 4B, the air was heavy and stale. Officers entered cautiously. The blinds were drawn. There was no sound, no sign of a struggle at first glance. Then they saw her, face down on the carpet, hands limp. She was partially clothed, bruised, and badly decomposed. The body had been there for days. There were blood traces on the carpet, on a nearby broken lamp, and on a warped iron lying next to her. A towel had been shoved into her mouth. A power cord, believed to be from a lamp, was wrapped around her neck. Heather Stigliano had been murdered inside her home, but there was no evidence the killer had broken in. Investigators secured the scene and immediately called in the state's forensic crime lab. Initial observations noted lividity consistent with the body lying in place since the night of the 4th. No defensive wounds on her hands, which raised a troubling question. Did she know the person who killed her? No wallet, no purse. Her bedroom had been partially ransacked, drawers open, contents overturned. But it wasn't random. Her television remained. So did her stereo. This wasn't a burglary, at least not a standard one. Police began canvassing the area. Door-to-door interviews revealed little. One neighbor recalled seeing a middle-aged man knock on Heather's door a few nights prior. He wasn't someone from the building. No one recognized him. The investigation hit an early wall. With no forced entry, no immediate suspects, and no obvious motive, Myrtle Beach PD began to focus on victimology. Heather had arrived in Myrtle Beach in early September 1991. She rented her apartment through a local agency. She was friendly, if a bit reserved, according to neighbors. She worked double shifts at the restaurant. There were no active disputes, no reported harassment. Her mother was adamant. Heather would never invite a stranger into her apartment. If someone got inside, they were either expected or they had gained entry through manipulation or coercion. Forensic technicians found several key indicators: a hair on the towel that didn't match Heather's, a partial fingerprint on the bathroom door, a blood smear in the hallway not consistent with the victim's type. They also noted the apartment's lock had no visible damage. Either the killer had a key or was let in. Medical examiners conducted the autopsy on November 12th. Cause of death: manual strangulation with ligature compression and blunt force trauma to the head. The iron and lamp both bore transfer stains consistent with use as weapons. She had likely been attacked from behind, silenced quickly, and never given a chance to scream. Toxicology returned negative. No alcohol, no drugs. Heather was sober at the time of her death. Back at the scene, a forensics officer discovered a subtle smear pattern on the bathroom tile, consistent with someone cleaning up post-crime. It suggested the killer had attempted to wipe something down before leaving. But they missed the edges. That was a mistake. The data, however, aligned too cleanly. No camera surveillance, no witnesses, no clear motive. Sometimes that was the problem. Within 24 hours of the body's discovery, Heather's information was entered into the National Crime Information Center's vehicle database. Her Chevrolet was still missing. Investigators suspected it might be the key to unlocking the timeline. As forensic teams processed the scene, police reviewed Heather's call records. Her last known contact was a brief call to a coworker at 9:13 p.m. on November 4th. She said she was home safe and was going to make something to eat. That call was the last verified sign of life. The media didn't run with the case at first. A young woman murdered in her apartment was shocking, but not unprecedented. But when her identity was confirmed, an out-of-state family arrived at the press conference in tears. The public took notice. What no one knew then was that Heather's killer had already crossed state lines, and he wasn't done moving. The turning point came not from blood, fingerprints, or even eyewitnesses, but from a missing car. On November 12, 1901, one day after the body of Heather Stigliano was discovered in her Myrtle Beach apartment, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SRS-LED, initiated a statewide vehicle trace. Her car, a 1984 gray Chevrolet Cavalier, had not been seen since the night of November 4th. It was entered into NCIC as a stolen vehicle linked to an active homicide investigation. The vehicle was key for one reason: it represented movement. Whoever took it either left in a hurry or had planned to flee. Either way, tracking that car could bridge the gap between the crime scene and the suspect, who, up to this point, remained unidentified. Within 48 hours, the car pinged a match across state lines. At approximately 3:14 p.m. on November 14th, a Florida Highway Patrol officer ran a routine plate check on a vehicle parked awkwardly at a Shell station off I-95 near Daytona Beach. The match returned as stolen, wanted in connection with a homicide in Horry County, South Carolina. The officer initiated a non-emergency approach, and the man inside the vehicle did not resist. He was identified as James Bernard Whipple, age 38. Whipple had no South Carolina license, no vehicle registration, and no legitimate reason to be operating the Chevrolet. Inside the car, officers recovered the following items: a woman's wallet containing Heather Stigliano's ID and restaurant pay stubs, a kitchen-style steak knife with visible dried blood, a bent and scorched clothing iron, a broken wooden lamp base, partially wrapped in a grocery bag, a pair of women's earrings and personal effects not belonging to Whipple. Florida authorities immediately detained him under probable cause, pending coordination with South Carolina investigators. When asked why he had the vehicle, Whipple reportedly said, "It was just left there. Keys in the ignition. I figured someone didn't want it." The statement was inconsistent with the locked door crime scene back in Myrtle Beach. SLED sent a forensic team to Florida the following morning to process the car. Blood swabs taken from the knife and interior carpet were rushed for testing. A match to Heather's blood type was confirmed. Technicians also lifted multiple latent prints from the door handles, gear shift, and dashboard. At least one palm print matched the partial recovered in Heather's bathroom. Digital evidence was non-existent. It was 1991. There were no cell phones, no GPS pings, no dash cams. The trail was analog: paper receipts, gas station logs, toll booth records. Officers traced Whipple's travel route using fuel purchases tied to debit card logs and local surveillance footage from gas stations that did have analog recording systems. From Myrtle Beach to Daytona Beach, he had made at least 4 stops. Each stop aligned with Heather's stolen vehicle usage. Detectives also obtained footage from a marathon station outside Savannah, Georgia. The tape showed a man matching Whipple's description, buying a sandwich and drinks, clearly using Heather's car. Timestamp: 11:42 a.m., November 7th. That placed him on the road 3 days after the murder, heading south. For investigators, it wasn't just about catching a suspect, it was about sequence. If the car was driven out on November 5th, that confirmed the body remained undiscovered for nearly a week, giving the suspect a long lead time. One of the lead detectives remarked in his field notes, "He didn't run. He wandered. He had days. That's what disturbed me. He took his time leaving." Back at Myrtle Beach, detectives interviewed Heather's coworkers again. One waitress recalled a strange interaction between Heather and an older male customer sometime in late October. He asked about her schedule. He left no tip. Heather had joked later that night, "Creep asked if I lived close by, like I'd tell him." The co-worker didn't know his name, but she remembered his face. She was shown a photo lineup with Whipple's DMV photo included. Her response was immediate. "That's him." The link between Whipple and Heather was circumstantial at this point, but growing. He was found with her car, her possessions, and in proximity to forensic materials that matched the murder scene. Still, no one could say why. What was the motive? Robbery? Personal obsession? A random act of violence? Whipple declined to speak after requesting counsel. No confession, no explanation. Just a signature on the Miranda waiver and a stare that lasted too long. The absence of digital evidence made physical evidence critical. That made the forensic sequencing airtight, if they did it right. The crime scene showed no forced entry. No sexual trauma could be confirmed, but possession of personal effects and murder weapons placed Whipple at the scene. Combined with prints, travel logs, and testimonial ID, it was enough for probable cause to charge him with first-degree murder. Investigators flew back to South Carolina on November 17th with Whipple in custody. By the time they landed, the narrative was no longer about a disappearance. It was about pursuit. And for Heather's family, it was the first time in 2 weeks that they had something close to an answer. Back in South Carolina, the evidence recovered from Heather Stigliano's apartment and the suspect's possession was now under a different kind of scrutiny. The crime scene had already provided early indicators: ligature marks, blunt trauma, no forced entry. But the investigation now entered its most technical phase: forensic processing. On November 18, 1991, technicians at the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division's Forensic Lab began cataloging and analyzing over 24 items. Top priority was assigned to 4 pieces: the clothing iron, the broken lamp base, the steak knife, and the towel removed from the victim's mouth. Each item was sealed, photographed, and examined under forensic protocols that were standard for the time but executed with unusual urgency due to the cross-state nature of the case. The iron, recovered from the floor next to Heather's body, showed trace patterns consistent with impact trauma. Under luminol screening, analysts detected microscopic splatter along the base plate's edge. Lab tests confirmed the blood belonged to Heather. No fingerprints were viable, which was consistent with the item being handled using the towel recovered at the scene. That towel was a critical find. It wasn't from Heather's bathroom set. It didn't match the other linens in the apartment. Fiber analysis showed a detergent signature inconsistent with brands found at the crime scene. A long, light-colored strand of hair, cut short, not Heather's color, was found embedded in the weave. A partial thumbprint, lifted from the lamp base, was matched against the fingerprints collected from the individual arrested in Florida. It was a hit. In parallel, analysts examined trace evidence collected from the vehicle. Soil samples from the Chevrolet's tires and undercarriage were cross-checked against a national geolocation database. The pattern didn't match Myrtle Beach alone. It indicated a stop in a marshy region consistent with parts of Georgia's coast. Investigators flagged this detail but didn't yet know if it was relevant or coincidental. Inside the vehicle's glove compartment, investigators recovered a restaurant napkin with handwriting. The ink had bled from moisture, but enough was legible to extract 3 words: 4B key copy. The phrase was entered into the case file but left inconclusive. The lock at Heather's apartment showed no sign of forced entry. Whether the suspect had gained access by duplicating her key or being given one remained unclear. Meanwhile, the autopsy report on Heather Stigliano was finalized. The victim sustained 3 distinct types of injuries: bruising from blunt force consistent with both the iron and the lamp base, petechial hemorrhaging from strangulation, indicating the ligature had been tightened post-mortem, and internal bruising along the right shoulder and ribs, consistent with being pinned or restrained. Toxicology remained negative. No alcohol, no narcotics. Heather was conscious and sober at the time of the assault. The absence of defensive wounds suggested she was either caught off guard or subdued too quickly to react. Investigators began reconstructing the sequence: entry between 9:15 and 9:30 p.m., confrontation escalating to violence, silencing, and then strangulation. Based on rigor and lividity, the body had been undisturbed for hours before cooling. There were no drag marks. She had died in the same place she fell. Each discovery added another layer to the prosecution's case, but none answered the core questions. What triggered the confrontation? Why take the car, the knife, the lamp? Why transport the body's objects but leave the body? The profile didn't match a burglar. It didn't match a heat-of-the-moment homicide. It suggested something closer to control, deliberate, prolonged, and post-offense management. The behavioral unit at SLED was consulted for a preliminary read. Their note was short. This wasn't improvisational, it was opportunity turned intentional. In the background, investigators were still collecting witness statements. One came from a gas station employee near Savannah, Georgia. The man claimed he saw a traveler with blood on his shirt, refueling a gray Chevy and paying cash. When asked why he didn't report it, the man said, "It's Georgia. That doesn't always mean what you think it means." Despite the technical limitations of 1991, the forensic team built an evidence tree connecting physical items found in Heather's apartment with those found in the vehicle. Fiber links, blood patterns, DNA-type match, and latent prints created a forensic narrative that no longer required speculation. But the case was missing motive, and motive matters in court. Detectives reviewed all documentation, call records, and interviews for any sign of prior contact between Heather and the suspect. Aside from the waitress who had mentioned a disturbing interaction at the restaurant, there were no records tying them together, no shared address history, no employer connection, no criminal complaints, nothing. That blank space between two people who barely knew each other was now the most alarming part of the file. In towns like Myrtle Beach, this kind of case doesn't just threaten personal safety, it shakes public trust. The absence of logic in the crime made the community uneasy. If a woman could be murdered in her own home without warning, how could anyone feel safe? The police response at the time was cautious. "We believe this was an isolated incident," but privately, investigators knew they were dealing with someone who hadn't just killed once, but had practiced the silence afterward. By the third week of November 1991, the investigation had moved past the initial shock of the murder. With physical evidence mounting and the victim positively linked to the man caught with her vehicle and personal belongings, detectives began examining the suspect's past, not for motive, but for precedent. James Bernard Whipple was 38, no fixed residence, multiple arrests across at least 4 states, none for violent crimes, at least on paper. His rap sheet read like a career drifter: petty theft in Ohio, unauthorized use of a vehicle in Georgia, trespassing in North Carolina. But the gaps in the record raised questions. His charges rarely stuck long. He served time in local jails, but no long-term sentence. No clear employment, no family contact. The first comprehensive timeline of Whipple's activity began with a DMV profile. He had been issued an Ohio driver's license in 1987, expired and never renewed. Address listed: a trailer park outside Akron that had since been condemned. No current address. Investigators flagged it as transient behavior. A background check revealed 2 aliases used during prior arrests. One of those was used to check into the motel in Florida, where some of Heather's belongings had been discovered. That tied his attempt at misdirection directly to evidence recovery. It also demonstrated intentional concealment, which under South Carolina statute could elevate circumstantial evidence to willful obstruction. The interrogation began shortly after his return to South Carolina. Whipple waived his right to an attorney initially, but gave little to nothing in response. The detectives took a structured approach. Timeline first, contact points second, motive last. He denied knowing Heather, denied ever being in her apartment. When presented with evidence, her car, her ID in his wallet, the broken lamp base from her apartment found in his possession, he claimed they were already there, that she had let him borrow the car, that he found her dead and panicked. None of those claims held up against forensic findings. The front door lock showed no sign of damage or picking. The apartment key was never recovered. The receipt referencing 4B key copy found in the vehicle became more relevant. Forensic technicians also confirmed the print lifted from the bathroom door matched Whipple's right palm, placing him inside the apartment beyond just casual contact. At this stage, SLED investigators turned to behavioral profiling. Whipple's history, while nonviolent officially, carried markers common among opportunistic predators: economic instability, low impulse control, manipulation through charm. His pattern wasn't random, it was methodical in its own chaotic structure. He chose locations where he was invisible, women with no nearby family, quiet residences. He didn't plan murders, but once presented with opportunity, he controlled the aftermath with unsettling calm. A request for interstate case correlation was filed. Georgia authorities responded with interest in an unsolved disappearance from 1989, involving a young woman last seen at a rest stop near Savannah. The link was tentative, but the timelines overlapped. Whipple had been issued a citation for loitering in that region within the same month. No charges were filed related to that case, but it changed the conversation around motive in the Heather Stigliano case. This wasn't about theft. It wasn't even about the car. The actions were not impulsive, they were repeated. In a legal setting, patterns matter. Prosecutors prepared for indictment. The evidence strategy prioritized the following sequence. Blood evidence on the iron and knife. DNA confirmed. Fingerprint match on apartment surfaces. Possession of stolen items. False statements during interrogation. Absence of plausible alternative explanation. Heather's family was briefed privately on the direction of the case. They were told not to expect motive. In cases like these, the why is often speculative, but that doesn't make the accountability less clear. The file now included a behavioral profile, a forensic evidence log, and a travel history showing deliberate evasion. That was enough to proceed with first-degree murder charges. As for Whipple, he never requested bail. He stopped speaking altogether once counsel was appointed. That silence in a courtroom would speak loudly. Sometimes what's missing from a case is just as telling as what's left behind. By late November 1991, the investigation into Heather Stigliano's murder had moved out of the shadows and into the preparation phase. The forensic results were solid, the suspect was in custody, and the timeline held. But moving toward trial wasn't just a matter of procedure. It meant framing everything into something a jury could understand, without confusion, without contradiction, and most of all, without doubt. At the Horry County Solicitor's Office, a team of prosecutors began reviewing every piece of evidence submitted by SLED. They weren't just checking for admissibility, they were testing for narrative strength. Physical evidence meant little if it couldn't be delivered clearly under cross-examination. The knife, the lamp base, the iron, these items weren't just weapons. They were anchors in time. Each one had to be placed in the scene, linked to the victim, and connected to the man now refusing to explain them. Whipple remained silent after counsel was appointed. He made no statements, refused all plea discussion, and entered a default not guilty plea through his defense attorney. That silence shifted the pressure to the prosecution, who now needed to shape a clean arc: pre-crime, contact, entry, attack, and escape. No emotional framing, just hard logic. Heather's phone records were reanalyzed. Her last outgoing call placed her inside her apartment at 9:13 p.m. on November 4th. The forensic pathologist estimated time of death between 9:30 and 10 hours. The neighbor had reported seeing an unfamiliar man near the building earlier that evening. That put contact, opportunity, and time window all within 60 minutes. With no forced entry, the prosecution argued Heather had either let him in or he had a duplicate key, supported by the handwritten 4B key copy reference recovered from the suspect's vehicle. In forensic testimony prep, lab technicians confirmed the blood on the knife belonged to Heather. The fingerprint on the bathroom door belonged to Whipple. The lamp base and iron bore transfer stains consistent with the wounds detailed in the autopsy. All physical links aligned with the pathology report. No elements contradicted each other. That precision helped strengthen the prosecution's intent to pursue first-degree murder, asserting that while the entry might not have been premeditated, the killing and its cover-up were. Meanwhile, community attention grew. News reports had begun naming Heather publicly. Her image, usually a high school yearbook photo, was shown alongside phrases like brutal assault, unprovoked killing, and silent neighbor. Those closest to her said the headlines never felt right. Heather wasn't just a victim. She was a person who had lived quietly, worked hard, and died without cause. Her mother requested the media stop referring to her as the girl from Myrtle Beach. Heather wasn't from there. She'd only been in the city for 8 weeks. She came looking for life, and instead found the end of it. The emotional weight of the case didn't alter the legal strategy, but it added urgency. For the lead prosecutor, it was clear. This wasn't just about a conviction. It was about accountability that could withstand scrutiny. But defense counsel was watching for missteps. With no confession and a mostly circumstantial timeline, they hinted they might challenge the chain of custody on key items and question the interpretation of DNA evidence, a tactic not uncommon in early 90s trials where jury education on forensic science was limited. There were no cameras, no witnesses inside the apartment. The defense would argue that even if Whipple had handled the lamp or the iron, it didn't prove murder, that he panicked, that he fled. But the prosecution's counterweight would rest not on speculation, but on pattern. The silent entry, the methodical cleanup, the rapid interstate disappearance, and the refusal to speak when confronted with direct evidence. By early December 1991, the court scheduled a preliminary hearing. It wouldn't be the trial yet, but it would be the first time both sides presented their framing. Heather's family would attend. The room would be quiet. Most of the public still didn't know the details. That hearing would change that. Sometimes in criminal cases, the greatest challenge isn't finding the truth. It's presenting it with enough weight that 12 strangers can see it for what it is. On December 12, 1991, the preliminary hearing for State of South Carolina versus James Bernard Whipple opened at the Horry County Judicial Center. It wasn't a trial, but the courtroom was nearly full. To most in attendance, it felt like the start of something final. Heather Stigliano's family sat in the second row, flanked by victim advocates and two plainclothes deputies. Across the aisle, the defense table remained quiet. Whipple entered in restraint gear, his demeanor flat, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. He didn't speak during the proceeding. His attorney spoke for him and would continue to do so for the duration of the case. The hearing had a single objective: establish probable cause. The state needed to demonstrate that the evidence gathered was sufficient to support the murder charge, even before a grand jury convened. The prosecutor opened with a focused summary. A 19-year-old woman found deceased in her locked apartment. Cause of death: blunt force trauma and strangulation. The defendant was found in possession of the victim's vehicle, property, and forensic evidence, linking him directly to the scene. There was no mention of motive. That omission was intentional. The weight of the case rested on what could be proven, not what could be speculated. The first witness was a lead investigator from Myrtle Beach Police Department. He described the scene inside Heather's apartment in exact terms. No forced entry, the body face down, clothed but disheveled, ligature marks on the neck, blood patterns indicating impact. He confirmed the recovery of a warped iron and broken lamp base, both later tied to the victim's injuries. Next came the forensic pathologist. Her report had already been submitted to the court in writing, but under oath she clarified details that would matter to the court. The injuries were consistent with a sustained attack. There was no evidence of defensive wounds. The time of death was estimated within 45 minutes of Heather's last phone call. Then came the forensic analyst who processed the items recovered from the suspect's possession in Florida. She confirmed blood matches on the knife and iron, fingerprint match on a door frame in the victim's bathroom, and partial fiber transfer on the towel used as a gag. Fibers not consistent with the victim's household linen. The defense objected to the towel evidence, claiming contamination could not be ruled out. The objection was noted but overruled. The chain of custody for all items had been documented in full. There were no outbursts, no theatrics. What the hearing lacked in drama, it delivered in precision. The judge took less than 2 minutes to rule. Probable cause was established. The case would move forward to grand jury. Bail was denied. Legally, it was a small step. But for the Stigliano family, it was the first official recognition that Heather's life and death had legal meaning. Not just a file, not just a news headline. After the hearing, prosecutors met privately with the family. They laid out the next phase: grand jury proceedings, then formal indictment, followed by trial preparations. No promises were made. They acknowledged the absence of a confession or eyewitness. The outcome would rest on physical evidence and how well it stood up under cross-examination. Meanwhile, the defense requested discovery on all forensic materials and police logs. They hinted they might challenge the timeline, suggesting the crime could have occurred hours earlier or later than prosecutors claimed. Enough, they argued, to create reasonable doubt about premeditation. It wasn't a new tactic, but it emphasized the importance of narrative control. From that point on, every movement in the case would serve one of two purposes: strengthen the state's theory or expose a gap that could unravel it. For those of us tracking the case closely, it was a reminder of how fragile justice is at this stage. The evidence was strong, but strength isn't always clarity, and clarity is what wins trials. By January 1992, the case against James Bernard Whipple was formally moving toward trial. The grand jury had returned a true bill of indictment on charges of first-degree murder, possession of a weapon during a violent crime, and interstate flight to avoid prosecution. These weren't headlines anymore. They were court filings, and that meant the state had to do what prosecutors are rarely comfortable doing: translate years of experience and weeks of forensic review into a version of events 12 strangers could follow. Jury selection began under high scrutiny. The judge ordered a change of venue motion denied, citing local media coverage as consistent with the public interest, not prejudicial in tone. That meant the trial would stay in Horry County. Heather Stigliano had been killed in Myrtle Beach. The courtroom would stay near the scene. From the first pool of over 70 potential jurors, both sides moved methodically. Prosecutors prioritized candidates who had respect for forensic science and would not require a confession to accept guilt. The defense, by contrast, favored those uncomfortable with circumstantial evidence, and those who believed that fleeing didn't necessarily mean guilt. Voir dire revealed what the case had become: a test of trust in the science. Potential jurors were asked about their views on fingerprint reliability, DNA certainty, and whether motive should be required to believe a murder had occurred. One juror was dismissed after stating, "I think a killer would confess if they did it. Silence feels like innocence." In the end, 12 were seated: 7 women, 5 men, 2 alternates. Ages ranged from 27 to 61. None knew Heather personally, but one admitted having worked in the same shopping center as the restaurant where she was last seen. The defense did not challenge. As pretrial motions were finalized, the defense began to reveal pieces of its strategy. They planned to challenge the reliability of forensic timelines. Specifically, they suggested that the estimated time of death might be off by several hours, casting doubt on the tight window prosecutors had built. If they could expand that window, they could introduce reasonable doubt as to who had access to the apartment and when. To counter that, the prosecution leaned heavily on pathology sequencing. They brought in an external forensic consultant from Georgia who reviewed lividity data, body temperature decay, and rigor onset. He testified in preliminary hearings that, based on ambient room conditions and confirmed witness timelines, the time of death most likely occurred between 9:30 and 10:15 p.m., consistent with Heather's last known phone activity. It wasn't about perfect certainty, it was about medical consistency, and in 1992, that was the standard required. Meanwhile, back-channel media pressure was building. A syndicated crime columnist ran a feature titled "The Stranger Who Didn't Knock," detailing how Heather had moved to South Carolina seeking independence and was instead hunted within the safety of her own apartment. Prosecutors took note. Emotional framing like that had no place in trial, but its presence in the public eye couldn't be ignored. Internally, the prosecution team reviewed the jury's likely perception of the crime scene. The fact that there was no struggle, no scream, and no sign of forced entry meant the jury would have to believe that Heather either let her killer in or had her key stolen. With no known relationship between her and Whipple, the burden would be proving opportunity and access, without relying on motive. In the background, Heather's family had chosen to remain silent publicly. No press statements, no interviews. They believed the case should stand on its evidence, not on their grief. But privately, they provided key personal details the prosecution planned to use in opening statements. Not to sway with emotion, but to establish credibility. Heather was punctual, private, and kept a fixed work schedule. Deviating from routine wasn't just unlikely, it was uncharacteristic. That detail would support the theory that she had come home, locked the door, and within minutes encountered the person who would kill her. On February 3, 1992, the trial date was set. Whipple remained in custody, No plea agreement was offered, and none was requested. The prosecution prepared 18 witnesses. The defense, 5. No psychiatric evaluation had been submitted, and no affirmative defense, such as insanity or diminished capacity, had been filed. That meant the trial would be a direct contest over fact and evidence, not excuses. In cases like this, clarity beats complexity, and for a jury asked to weigh silence against evidence, what mattered now was how the facts would be delivered, not just what they said. The trial of State of South Carolina versus James Bernard Whipple opened in March 1994 at the Horry County Courthouse. It had been nearly 2.5 years since Heather Stigliano's murder. For her family, it was not closure, it was procedure. For prosecutors, it was a test of evidence. How well it would hold up under the glare of courtroom scrutiny, without a confession, without a motive, and without any expression of remorse from the man accused. The prosecution opened with the facts. A 19-year-old woman murdered in her apartment with no signs of forced entry. A known transient found 10 days later, across state lines, in possession of her car and personal belongings. Physical evidence connecting the defendant to the scene. No alibi, no explanation. They didn't lead with emotion. They didn't need to. Over the course of the trial, the jury heard from forensic pathologists, crime scene analysts, law enforcement, and character witnesses. The most impactful moments weren't dramatized, just methodically presented. Bloodstain pattern analysts described the angle and depth of the impact injuries. Lab technicians confirmed the DNA match on the towel, the knife, and the iron. The medical examiner detailed the pressure trauma to Heather's neck, the timeline of rigor, and the absence of defensive wounds. Each witness reinforced the core structure. Heather had come home from work, entered her apartment, and within minutes was confronted by someone she likely didn't expect. There were no signs of prolonged struggle, no objects missing that would suggest robbery, no romantic relationship, no messages, no disputes. Just a quiet evening, interrupted, and ended with brutal efficiency. The defense strategy focused entirely on doubt. They argued that Heather's time of death was not as fixed as the state claimed. They challenged the completeness of the forensic chain of custody. They questioned the lack of fingerprints on the doorknob. They offered no alternative suspect, but they emphasized the lack of motive. Why would a man with no known connection to the victim, no history of violent offenses, suddenly commit murder? But the jury wasn't being asked to answer why. They were being asked to determine who. And the answer, through evidence, was consistent. James Whipple did not testify. His attorney advised against it. During the state's closing arguments, prosecutors reminded the jury that silence in a criminal trial is a right, but it is not an alibi. When faced with proof, Whipple had no rebuttal. When asked to account for the knife, the towel, the car, the lamp, he said nothing. When shown photos of the woman he was accused of killing, he looked away. In April 1994, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. At sentencing, prosecutors pursued the death penalty, citing the brutality of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim. The defense attempted to humanize Whipple by introducing evidence of childhood neglect, addiction history, and mental instability. The judge allowed limited testimony but found no grounds for psychiatric defense. Whipple had not claimed mental illness. He had not claimed anything at all. The court issued a sentence of death by electrocution. Heather's family gave no public statement that day. A representative simply said, "We respect the jury's decision. We remember Heather for who she was, not for how she died." For 2 years, the case was considered closed. But in 1996, the South Carolina Supreme Court overturned the death sentence. In its written opinion, the court stated that while Whipple's guilt was overwhelmingly supported by evidence, the imposition of the death penalty relied in part on the suggestion of sexual assault, an element the forensic record could not confirm conclusively. There had been no DNA evidence of penetration, no eyewitness, no confession, and the court ruled that without clear support for that aggravating factor, the sentence must be vacated. The conviction for murder stood, but Whipple's sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to Broad River Correctional Institution, where he remains. To date, he has not issued a statement, expressed remorse, or participated in any rehabilitation program. Records show he has refused every interview request. No further charges were brought against him, though other jurisdictions continue to review cold cases with similar patterns. Heather's family eventually relocated. In 1998, they created a small scholarship in her name at a community college in Pennsylvania, awarded annually to a young woman studying criminal justice. Quietly, her memory became something other than a headline. This case never had a twist. It wasn't solved by a hidden diary, a last-minute confession, or an anonymous tip. It was solved by pattern recognition, procedural pressure, and forensic science. It's a reminder that most real-life investigations don't revolve around drama. They revolve around detail. And detail, when pursued relentlessly, tells the truth without needing embellishment. There's a message in that. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly in lab reports and court transcripts, in fingerprints and timelines, in silence that means more than words. Sometimes the absence of a reason is the clearest indicator of who a person really is. Sometimes justice doesn't come with closure, and sometimes closure doesn't come with answers. But if this case teaches us anything, it's that every detail matters. That behind every file, every report, every name on a cold case list, there's a real life, a real family, and a real story that deserves to be told. As someone who has followed this case from the beginning, I believe we owe it to victims like Heather to keep asking the hard questions and to never let silence win. What do you think justice really looks like in a case like this? Have you or someone you know ever felt the weight of unanswered questions? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, whether you're watching from South Carolina, California, or anywhere around the world. And if this story moved you or made you think, take a second to subscribe. That way you won't miss the next case we uncover together.